I just thought I'd better fill you in on what it is that we're actually doing.
That would be useful.
So, I've started collaborating with a theatre company that specializes in storytelling.
Ah,
And where we were in the middle of rehearsing a show called Four Tales to Save the World
yes.
with four different authors who've written four short stories on a future Wales. Imagining Wales after different environmental, political, economic impacts.
Yes.
Nobody foresaw COVID, by the way, but anyway. Um, and
That's
then as
cool.
as as part of that, wanted to put together a series of interviews with experts, basically, on their take on the future. If you can just tell us very quickly who you are and what Zero Carbon Britain is, please.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for getting in touch. My name's Paul Allen. I trained as an electrical engineer in Liverpool University. I've done all sorts of things. We've been part of a team that redesigned vaccine fridges and blood banks so they could run super efficiently off solar panels in all sorts of remote locations around the world. And really, for the past 30 odd years, I've worked at the Centre for Alternative Technology. Zero Carbon Britain was kicked off around about 15 years ago. And it's an idea for really extending what CAT offers to its clients, the community around it. It's how we can connect all of what CAT's been exploring for the past 45 years to show how they all fit together in one possible scenario to actually act on climate, to do what the science demands. And what we did is we built on CAT's original 1977 alternative energy strategy for the UK, which was presented to Tony Benn's Ministry of Energy, which was the first time that we'd ever sort of questioned this idea of just more and more growth, more and more energy is good, and say, well, we have to begin to use energy more efficiently and switch to cleaner sources. So we also built upon that. We've launched several reports. We then take it to different clients, different user groups, get their feedback, go back and do more research and begin to fill in the detail and bring it to life in clearer and clearer detail. And we link this to the educational offer that CAT makes in terms of school visits, having a positive vision. It's very important for young people, but also the skills and the people who want to make their careers out of helping solve the climate challenge and other environmental challenges. And it's all free to download and backed by training.
So can you just briefly outline Zero Carbon Britain's 2019 report and its main conclusions, please?
Well, being an electrical engineer, one of the first things that you do is you unpick the problem. You get to understand the problem in greater and greater detail. So we began unpicking what I call energy extreme normality. The amount of energy we use to deliver society's goals has just gone up and up and up and up, to the point where, at least before lockdown, we were using enormous amounts of energy, all of us, every day, in a high energy Western consumer lifestyle. And the impacts of that are beginning to hit us. We're experiencing the effects of climate already in Mid Wales. I mean, we had the strangest February I can remember here, with 4 floods almost every weekend. But it's understanding the nature of this problem, because it's a wicked problem. And the idea of a wicked problem is there's no single solution, that it's deeply entwined with how we live, and it's feeding back on itself. Climate change isn't a static problem, it's actually feeding back on itself. That climate feedback's melting ice exposes the sea. Ice reflects about 90% of the incoming sunshine. The sea absorbs much more than that. So the less ice there is, the more the earth warms. The more the earth warms, the less ice there is. So it's this wicked nature of the problem. So we have to develop wicked solutions, solutions that also feed back on themselves. So the fundamental philosophy behind Zero Carbon Britain is 2 processes: is powering down the amount of energy we use to deliver society's goals by rethinking housing, buildings, transport, energy, food, diets, land use, whilst also powering up clean energy at the same time. So it's 2 processes going on at the same time. And the key finding from our 2019 report really confirms that we have all the technologies to do this. We're not in a stuck position waiting for some fabulous new technology, a new type of battery or a new type of solar panel to be invented to achieve it. All the technologies are there and shouting, come on, use it, come on and use it. And in fact, with feedbacks, the more we've installed solar panels, the more investment there has been in production, so the cheaper they've got. The cheaper they get, the more viable they are in more applications. That's true for wind, offshore wind. So it's actually, they're feeding back. If we look at the price of a wind turbine or a solar panel when CAT was formed, or even the price 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the cost falls have been astounding. But another feedback is the growing recognition that we've had over the 14 years of doing zero carbon Britain. When we started, there was no school strikes. There was no active citizens locking themselves to things. There were no council emergency declarations. All of that has fed back. And particularly in the last 18 months, the number of climate emergency declarations and citizens creating this space, saying we need to do this, is accelerating and feedbacking on itself. And if it wasn't for lockdown, people would be out there getting that message across. But because of the innovative skills as well that exists, little parts of the zero carbon Britain model have actually been brought to life in areas all across Wales, all across the UK, all across the EU, all across the world. These real life examples of a mass retrofit of a social housing block, or a community owned hydro, or a wind turbine, or a local food supply systems. These are real life examples are growing, but they're actually all proven because you can look at the data, you can see it works, you can see the people getting the benefits, and they're shovel ready to go. But I think possibly the most exciting feedback is the concept of multi-solving. Is that if we do the things outlined in the 2019 Zero Carbon Britain report, we can actually have co-benefits in all sorts of other sectors, like cleaner urban air reduces NHS costs and reduces deaths, or getting more people walking and cycling can actually make us happier and healthier. So beginning to identify those multi-solving co-benefits, like the jobs. If you present a scenario for what you're going to do to the UK, you can then look at how many jobs that could create, which is another important feedback, because that allows you to then engage with trade unions, engage with people who are unemployed. It widens the connection behind the Zero Carbon Britain report. But the last report really started to delve into the detail of, if you're a council and you've declared a climate emergency, well, how do you actually do this? So we looked at best practice from around the world, and we identified there are 4 directions. Firstly, you've got downwards, the things that you already have control over as a council. It might be the supply of food for hospitals, it might be buildings, whatever. You can begin to make policies for that. But then you've got to think of the things that you need to learn, and so you can talk to other councils. You can share sideways, you can ask them, do you have an example about this? And begin to sort of share what you've done here, like the Brotherly Community Renewables. Other councils might want to learn about that. So share sideways, and then look at the things like if you're a council and they're going to expand an airport right next to you, you don't have control over that. You have to lobby upwards. If you need the resources to do things, you have to lobby upwards. But if you've already worked sideways and other councils are with you within that region, then lobbying upwards together is more effective. But the 4th direction is really important too, where you look at making sure everybody who's making decisions about how you're running hospital buildings or how you're running public transport has the training they need to be fully aware of the solutions and the scale of the problem. So you've got these 4 directions, and once councils and communities, I mean, you can even do it as a family. Once you've got the 4 directions, you can begin to identify the energies and the changes you need. And it's all free to download. So it's called Zero Carbon Britain, Rising to the Climate Emergency.
And it's a fascinating report as well. And it was great to see that what many of us had suspected over the years, which was that the technological solutions are already out there. It was great to see that confirmed with some hard and fast figures in the report. It was interesting listening to you talking about the local councils as well, because of course, one of the things Zero Carbon Britain is really trying to do is to do something effective. You're trying to be proactive and you're trying to help people to act in different ways, specifically in the local government and generally the political sphere. And in the report, you point out that there is a huge gulf between what is physically demanded by science to address the climate crisis and what is seen as politically possible. And you call this the physics politics gap. Now, you've already touched on one way local councils can start working together to address this physics politics gap. But how else do we close this gap, do you think?
Well, I think it has been a yawning chasm rather than just a gap. Where, I mean, when we launched Zero Carbon Britain in 2007, the target, I think, at that time was a 60% reduction by 2050 in emissions. Because we talked to the climate scientists who'd said this. So we modeled what the climate science said. But there was a huge gap between that 60%, and that 60% became an 80% reduction. And it did get enshrined by law. And now they have recognised zero by 2050 as the UK's target, which applies to Wales as well. But I think we need to do it faster than that. If you listen to what the chief scientist, the ex-chief scientist, Sir David King, has been saying, he's been saying that really we need to be thinking about it by 2040. So how do we close that gap? Well, firstly, by briefing all politicians, and we've done launches of the report in the Senedd, we've done them in Scottish Parliament. I've taken it to Ireland and done it in the Irish Parliament, and of course in London. But it's more than that. It means coming together. It means coming together as a society and realizing their common values and common interests. But I think a positive vision is important. Now, we can imagine a positive vision, but if we can actually use evidence-based, hourly modeling to show a positive vision, it gives a lot more traction. Then we can begin to pick out the co-benefits, jobs, resilience for an area, resilience for a town. And doing this, by coming together, we create a space that brave politicians dare step in. And by bridging divides of class, culture, race, etc., we reveal a sort of survival solidarity. And I think the key thing at the moment is the COVID crisis has shown that talking does not solve the problem. Now, talking is essential, but it's the action that we need to talk about and agree upon that actually solves the problem. I think that's been a bit of a game changer.
So you propose several ways in which we can reach carbon zero in Britain, and one of which is changing the way we produce food. And in a rural area such as Machynlleth, where farmers are heavily reliant on livestock, how do you propose the local industry adapts?
Well, I think the local industry has to recognise that we need a common cause here, because the impacts in the local area, floods to farms. I was doing a presentation, I think it was the Farmers Union for Wales in Aberystwyth, and the presenters from the union said that they'd been up all night trying to deal with floods on their farm. This was in February. The climate impacts on farms, the uncertainty about the changing seasons and the more extreme weather is impacting farms. So it's a common cause. I think farmers clearly recognise we have to do this. The Machynlleth area was the first council, town council, to declare a climate emergency. And it was unanimous by all the councillors. There was a lot of momentum behind it. Will the Butcher signed it. And I think if we can focus on local resilience and local supply chains, it allows the farms to sell directly through the butchers, which we recognise the value of, into the local community. That is much more resilient than stuff coming from all around the world. But also there's a potential in the transition for more energy, because we need more energy locally, so we need access to land. So more energy systems can be installed on farms that can add to the farm income. If you talk to Edward Jones, the farmer from Kemais, who's had a wind farm for a long time on his land, it has really helped the farm. But then also net negatives. If we're going to capture carbon out the atmosphere with natural systems, that's a potential new income stream for local farmers. So I think what we need to do is draw upon the traditional wisdom of farming in Wales, the mixed farming history. If we look back over time, farms were a lot more mixed than they are today. We have to recognize the financial forces that have forced farms into being a lot less varied in how they use the land, and recognize that in our own tradition in Wales, there is a much more mixed farming. There were even particular types of crops that were specific to particular valleys. So we need to draw upon our wisdom to do that. And agroecology should be well supported rather than importing chlorinated chicken from America. We need to have systems that work to support our own farmers. But we need to also focus on the right mix of foods. What's the healthy mix of foods for a human being to eat? So we live longer and we reduce health costs. But that doesn't mean we have to stop eating meat. But the meat that we do eat should be local, and it should come through the local abattoir. And in fact, the vegetables we eat should be local. I mean, I came across in a supermarket a packet of radishes that had been grown in Peru. I looked at these little 4 radishes in a plastic box, and I thought they were sitting in the soil in Peru. Now, I know in the back of Machynlleth we could grow huge amounts of radishes. We could be self-reliant in lots and lots of food. There is no need to be bringing vegetables from Peru. But I think the way that this happens has to be through a co-creative, participative process where we're listening to lots of different voices and co-creating something that's much more resilient and can actually increase the revenues for farms compared with what's going to happen, because farming as usual is not going to continue. We're looking at some of the legislation that's coming in, the post-Brexit stuff. Farming is in for a challenge like it or not, let alone from climate. So we need to work with the farmers to make sure that farms stay in local hands and that we value things a bit more. I mean, people will pay a bit more for a locally roasted coffee or a locally hot brewed beer or something that's got a bit of authenticity. And I think we need to recognize that and thank the local community, the farming community, for all they've done to keep it going here.
This isn't a question that I sent to you beforehand, so apologies. And
media always have a trick surprise.
I'm not the media. What do you say? Anyway,
yes, fire away.
Well, it's just because you mentioned Brexit, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this moment in time when many of us were disturbed by the political discourse around Brexit on both sides, not just on the Leave or the Remain. And, is Brexit an opportunity, seeing as the British farming industry is going to be leaving CAP, the European subsidy system? Is it an opportunity to create a more sustainable and resilient farming industry in Britain? And how do we rescue that opportunity from the current government's clear trajectory to drive down standards? How do we ensure that they improve standards and that we move towards a far more sustainable industry, do you feel?
Well, I think we're in a difficult position, and within every crisis there is an opportunity. And I fear that farming is heading towards a crisis. I studied economics. Basically, in economics, there's a term called dumping, where you actually sell a product into a market at a loss to clear the other providers. If we get dumped cheap food from overseas, it's going to make it very hard to continue as a farmer. And that's standard global economics, that they've done it with steel, they've done it with lots of other things. So what we need to do is really take back the power. We have the choice to put our pounds wherever we want to. There is no app that forces us to buy A or B. We can choose what we want. So we need to set up supply chains that give people the choices to buy the things that they really connect to. Now, we're also going to go through some fairly austere financial times, and some people will be really skint. So we've got to move that locally connected food away from something that's just too expensive for working people to consider. It has to be done in an effective, efficient way. But there are opportunities within it, but I think to be facing so many challenges at the same time. And also listening to the news this morning about Zuckerberg trying to say he's got tools now that will stop false news flowing through Facebook. We have to recognize what's the source of the information we're getting and how valid is it. And that was on the news this morning. I think it's really, really important that we connect locally and we feel like Team Machanllath, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And we're going to be talking to people with an interest and who are actively trying to develop the local economy in terms of food. So that's definitely one of the conversations we're going to be following up on. Just the last question now. And it's in many ways, it's the main question for this part of this project, because it's a question that, I mean, just like food and many of the other issues, it doesn't just come down to the responsibility of local government or even local councils. It really comes down to personal responsibility with regards to energy. What mix of energy sources should an area like Machynlleth be considering, and what could be done to set Machynlleth on a path towards clean energy? But thinking of that question in terms of sort of personal decisions we can make, and also what decisions should we be lobbying the local council and the Welsh Assembly to take on our behalf?
Yes, very, very important question. I think we have to recognise at the moment we have declared a climate emergency in Machynlleth. We got on BBC News for doing it. And active citizens, people from the council, local NGOs have formed local climate action groups, including food, transport, and energy. And I think the first thing that citizens need to do is engage with that group and revitalise all of those groups, because at the moment, those groups are having to carry on exploring this question via Zoom. It's quite challenging. We've been doing it for a while. And it would be good to get some new energy into those groups and begin to explore that through Ecodovi and other organisations to get everybody is welcome to input their voice. But the important thing to recognise in energy is that we need to power down the amount of energy we're using in the Machynlleth by having programs to insulate buildings, by rethinking transport systems, by just being sensible about how we use things. I mean, one exciting thing in Machynlleth is the repair cafes, because there's a lot of energy behind a phone or a toaster. And if you can repair it, then you don't have to throw it away and get another one made. So powering down in all those sectors, I think, is important. But then we have to power up energy locally. We have Brotherby Community Renewables that run renewables locally. So the profits from making it go to the local community. That has a multiplier effect. And we could have more renewables owned by Powys County Council. So the profits doesn't go to some Arab Emirate investors or whatever. Profits goes to fund schools and hospitals. But it doesn't mean that all of the renewables, say the wind turbines, that Powys might invest in and might reap the benefits from, have to be in Powys. They could be offshore. It's good to put them where the energy is, and we have an enormous amount of offshore. So I'd be excited about a municipal program that allows local authorities to access Britain's offshore renewable resources and reap the benefits rather than overseas investors. But I think the important thing is to come together around a plan that we're all happy with, bridging divides of class, culture, race, and come up with this sort of collective survival solidarity plan that isn't something that a small and highly enthusiastic group of around the town are suggesting or advisors to Powys County Council. It's something that has been part of an open and inclusive process. And then if we can begin to look at ways that we can get the sort of maintenance, the installation jobs managed locally, it has co-benefits.
Just very quickly, for anybody in the Machynlleth area who's not aware of what local groups and networks there are that they might be able to join in with, can you think of any that you'd like to suggest?
I think all of them, thinking about there's a well-being group, there's a transport group, there's a food group, there's lots of food projects springing up, there's an energy group, there's a steering group, and I think you can access them all via Ecodavi, but they are developing their own website at the moment. But trouble is the group's quite cash strapped and all in lockdown at the moment. But we're working on a sort of Huntcliffe Climate Action Group website, which will then allow people to input ideas, find out when the meeting starts, suggest new topics for new meetings. Possibly one of the other most interesting ways that we can draw upon the rich Welsh tradition is use of story, because data is important, evidence base is important, but graphs and numbers don't change hearts and minds. Stories change hearts and minds. And that's well rooted in the tradition in Wales. So to begin to pull together stories or draw upon traditional stories, to begin to think, how do where we are today connect with stories? Because stories are a way of passing values and passing ideas intergenerationally. So using the incredible richness of the culture of Wales to begin to tell the stories of what needs to happen next, I think it's a very, very useful thing to be thinking about. And it brings in the arts and the creative practitioners. I worked with an artist, Lola Perrin. She played music while I told the extraordinary story of human beings' energy and happiness. But then she went on to start something called Climate Keys, where she plays music to get everybody into a relaxed frame of mind. Then somebody makes an interesting intervention. Then she plays more music while the audience react to what they've heard. And then they have conversations. And mixing it with the music works in a way it wouldn't work if they were all just sitting in a room watching a PowerPoint. So it's not just story, it's music as well.
One of the things we're trying to do is to bring an emotional quality to the conversation. That's essentially our aim, mainly because it can feel very abstract and very removed from people's day-to-day lives, particularly when we're talking about relatively sort of boring decisions that need to be taken at a local structural level in local councils and the Welsh Assembly, for example. It's really difficult to get people to engage with that decision making because, to be frank, it's not very interesting and it's very process orientated. So to try and bring some emotional content to try and help people experience the realities that we may face, I think is it's our aim, it's our mission, if you like.